goes, accepted, she loves the job. That's what her career was ever since. So I have so much of course stuff in the business. But these three have. It's unbelievable.
Do you still subscribe?
No, I won't read the paper because I don't like what they stand for.
Yeah, we have a new thing this year, cold morning, and did it.
Once upon a
Good morning,
time.
good morning.
I'm listening on headphones.
Who didn't read the Times?
Right.
Grew up. It wasn't a question.
30 seconds later.
Look, well, I'm there, it's only like.
Good morning.
Robert,
You
you said
said out there today or tomorrow.
And it's so
And I'm gonna check
see his
personally.
mouth moving, and then I hear the words like, is sound traveling that slow?
Well, you know that one way or another, it's still gonna be, even if it's part, it's gonna be very Kaylee.
Something like.
Yeah, you have places, and you wanna go out after, right, for sure, 100%. Yeah, I'll believe that, it's either today or tomorrow.
Thank you.
I would have been there a little bit sometime last week, but things got a little bit.
Probably very busy this week. It's getting pretty warm out there.
Yeah. Okay.
Good morning.
Okay, wait a minute. Okay, Harvey, ready to go?
Good morning.
Morning, Harvey, good to see you.
How are you? Yes. Yeah.
Is this our last class?
No, we hope to have one next week with
With,
end of the year flair.
Silver Street.
something positive.
That's not something.
Okay, I think one day you should give a shear on, you know, tape already?
No, not yet.
I think
I
you
mean-
should give a shear on how those people who hold the Kol Yisrael can get around it, the Yichol sound.
I'm thinking of the name already.
How to cheat halachically?
Krispy Kreme cheating. That might get a lot of views. I'm not going to Chol Yisrael. How can I have a Krispy Kreme donut? Okay. We're taking offers for next year's shir too.
That every week.
But Be'ez Hashem, next week will be the last shir. We'll end with a flare. And Be'ez Hashem, should be fun.
You have stopped already?
Okay, good morning. Thank you everyone for coming from far and wide. Acknowledge the presence of my chashuva brother visiting from, let's call it the West Coast. Today's share is obviously a pretty serious topic, a heavy topic. We entitled it, "In the Aftermath of the Surfside Tragedy, Halachic Perspectives." Hebrew, it's the Inyan Ha'ason, the Surfside. And what happened just a mere 10 days ago, not far from where we're giving the share here in North Miami Beach, Surfside, Florida, a place that everyone in Florida has been to, probably almost everyone in New York has been to. Definitely a very popular spot. And some people call it's the 9/11 of South Florida. Definitely from looking at the remains of the building, it definitely evokes such images. It's eerie, because you have people that never really saw 9/11. It's been so many years. But the scene is obviously a very, very, devastating scene. You have the head of Israel Search and Rescue, after spending a week here, commenting that he's never seen a scene like this, even though he's been to tragedies, collapses all around the world. But the way this one figured out, nothing like it. Actually, one of the Hatzolah guys at the site told me that if you'd write a novel explaining how everything that possibly could go wrong, step after step, that's what happened over here. The way the building fell, no warning, it felt like a pancake. It happened in the middle of the night. They tried rescuing people within minutes of it crashing, and the rescuers came with major issues. They were able to reach people because of barriers, concrete barriers, and able to reach them. Fires broke out. Different points, the whole structure was too dangerous to be under. They actually think they're knocking down the building, hopefully in the next few hours. Somebody on the scene told me there's a whole pile of rubble which is right next to the facade of the building that's still there. They have to be extra, they haven't really been able to search that pile well, because the fear that when they touch that pile, the whole building is leaning on it, and it's going to come down. So they haven't even been able to get to everything yet, because of the nature of the fall, what happened. So it's really a really tough situation. It's probably, everyone knows someone connected in some way to that building. There's a Talmud who left his yeshiva just a year ago, whose father and uncle were there. His sister is the now famous Tehillim girl, sitting at the site saying Tehillim. Everyone knows somebody connected to the towers, these buildings that fell, and obviously it's a tremendous, tremendous loss. Even the people that survived have nothing. My children told me they were in one of the stores in the neighborhood, and someone came in to quote unquote shop for one of the families that lost everything. And the shopkeeper graciously said, take whatever you want. The amount of chesed that's going on at the same time is a tragedy. So it's all people that are there 24/7. There are people that were there within 10 minutes of the falling and cannot haven't left. Really, real tremendous, tremendous dedication. I actually got a message. People were asking for maybe mother's helpers, because these Hatzalah people haven't been home for like a week. And really heroic things. There were searchers that went in right away, knowing that the whole thing is not so stable. The fireman who went in texted his family before he went in to see what he could do to help save people. Amazing. It really, really was and is, you know, the 9/11, like a really defining moment here in South Florida where such a tragedy like this can happen. And in a certain sense, you know, if it would have just been terrorists, okay, you blame it on terrorists, you can direct your emotions, your angers, you know, what can we do to prevent that? And here, it does not seem to be anything like that, just pure, a building falling. Whatever safety issues, whatever things went on in the building over the years that led to this tragedy. In some ways, it makes that worse. It's harder to deal with. How could this happen? It can happen here. It can happen anywhere. So there's a lot of emotional feelings people have from this story. Just reading the Jewish publications this week. I walked away reading one of these articles. I'm like, boy, that was really depressing. I'm not sure you could even read that on Shabbos. Like, paint the picture. You know, it's not pretty. What I'd like to do today is go through step by step. I have here 4 halachic issues I'd like to spend time on. Really, a lot of these issues themselves could be a share. I figured, since this is such a broad-based tragedy, it's kedai to see, maybe not the full scope, but go through 4 different topics in halacha that I believe come about based on this situation. Obviously, there are more. I'm not claiming to address everything and paskin and everything, but we'll go through some halachas associated with this tragedy. And just our learning, our focusing on this should be a schus that I think the best way to say it is that all the families, all the people affected by the tragedy should be able to have the chizuk and everything should be good for them. Firstly, I'd like to discuss the halachas of a rescue effort. The halachas of what to do in such a situation where you have a collapse, a building collapse. And also what's eerie about that, for those of you who are doing Daf Yomi, I'm going to quote to you a Gemara that was yesterday's Daf. The Gemara on Pei Gimel Amud Aleph Maseches Yuma. It's actually part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Misha Nafal Lov Mapolas. If a building collapses upon a person, it's nothing new. It's happened throughout the ages. Safek hayasham, safek einasham. It's a safek whether there are people in the building or not. Especially pre-cell phone data, tracking people. We're not sure. Are people there? Safek hay, safek meis. It's a safek if I excavate it. Here, this is Hilchas Shabbos. If I do this on Shabbos, it's a safek, is a person alive? Chas v'shalom, the person passed. Safek Kusi, Safek Yisrael. It's a safek whether this person is a Gentile or a Jew. L'chal Shabbos for a Jew. Halacha is mafkichem alaves lagal. We excavate this rubble, this falling building, and we would be Machal Shabbos to do that. If you notice the person's alive, then you excavate him on Shabbos, once you find somebody. But if you find someone who's already dead, unfortunately dead, in that situation, you'd leave the body there till after Shabbos, and only then would you take the person out. It's mamish the Gemara from yesterday. This is brought in the Shulchan Aruch, Hilchos Shabbos. basically the same lashon. Chofetz Chaim comments that it's a little backwards. But the basic lashon. The Shulchan Aruch points out we would do this despite the fact there are many sveikos. You do not need a vadai clear situation of saving a life to be Machal Shabbos. Even a suffix, even if there's a chance that you might be able to save a life, for Machal Shabbos. And the Chofetz Chaim adds to this, Mishabura I put right on top of that on the sheets. Umari shahayisham be'ezam apoles. I realized I didn't send out the pictures of the Makomos yet to the home audience, but I'll get it to them. So it says, Umari shahayisham be'ezam apoles. The case is we know the person was there at the time of the collapse. We're not sure did the person leave. We know he was there. It could be the person left. It could be escaped. But Afal Pikein, Safek HaYisham, Safek Ein Hasham, the Mishnah, the Halacha says you would be Machal Shabbos for that. That's clear, the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch. Now the Chofetz Chaim adds, V'nira, to Hu Adin Afil Lo Re'inu Oso Mitchila Lahedja. Let's say we didn't place the person in the house. We all know the person's in the house. Could I still be Machal Shabbos? The case of the Mishnah, the case of the Shulchan Aruch, that's where we know the person's there. It could be he escaped. So in that case we say, you go in on Shabbos. But what about a case of you don't know if he's there in the first place? You don't know that he was there at the time of the collapse. The Chofetz Chaim writes, even in that case, it's normal at this time, 1 o'clock at night, it's normal for people to be in their homes. We'd also be Machal Shabbos, we'd also excavate this collapse. Chofetz Chaim says, I assume Misvara, that's also good enough. Right? It's not quoting anybody here. The Chofetz Chaim understands. It's the same story. It doesn't have to be that you know for sure the person's in the house. As long as there's an umdana, as long as there's a reason to believe normally people will be there, so you do it. If it would be a case where the odds are the person wouldn't be there, okay, then we wouldn't do that. But assuming it's a case when there's good odds, good time that the person would be there, it's reasonable to assume he's there, that's good enough. You don't have to know for sure that he was there. Obviously, a halacha like this is quite relevant. You know, when that building fell, so firstly, in our situation in Surfside, it fell early Thursday morning. Wasn't any Chol Shabbos cases. But if this would have happened on a Friday night, and it was found Shabbos morning, 100% people could go in and do whatever they can to save lives on Shabbos because of this idea. Whether you know the person's in the building or not, just the assumption that people should be there. It's a Friday night, there must be some people there for Shabbos. You go in. And you see the Gemara, Shulchan Aruch talks about that something if it's Jew, something if it's not a Jew. I heard someone say some of these apartments are owned by Jews, but they rent them out. A lot of the people there are full-time rentals, but it seems there also were some vacation. There's a good amount of those vacation. Therefore, there are a lot of mezuzahs on the doors, even if inside the apartment it isn't Jews, depending on the year. In the wintertime, a lot of times you have snowboard, birds come, so yeah, a lot of Jews. They said last year during the height of COVID, people escaped New York, they came to Florida. They said those apartments were full. Now, that's part of the hashkacha that, you know, you had different reports of how many people, how many Jewish people were in the building. It's still not clear exactly. But just because you have a mezuzah on the door doesn't necessarily mean there are Jews in it. I mean, it's an apartment owned by Jews. But any type of suffix, even if there's a small tzad that people are Jewish, then Chal Shabbos. You just point out, Huadin, practically speaking, it doesn't matter if they're Jews or non-Jews. Because once you're at the site, and once Hatzalah is there, or Jewish people are there are halachas of Eva. Just like Hatzalah would take a call on Shabbos for anyone, no matter what, religious background, you take calls for anyone. So then, in this type of situation, Shem Eva, you have to be Mechal Shabbos and not discriminate. Yes?
Just making this situation a little harder, it so happens that the point in time was the time between school and camp, which is a more transient period of time.
Right.
So it makes it even harder to keep track of people.
Right,
because
right.
their regular norms are not necessarily the same.
Yeah, yeah. We'll see. We'll get to some of those stories. But there are people that, in Florida, people come in and out all the time. And there are people that just got back to that apartment hours before.
Just to clarify, I think, isn't the assumption that it was in a Jewish neighborhood, there are Jews who reasonably live there, so we live in the neighborhood, it's the middle of the night, the chances that there was a yid there, pretty good.
Yes.
If it had been in Hialeah or Opelika or someplace where Jews don't go, it may have been a different question or a different story.
Correct. Right? Berger's pointing out, where the building was. I mean, you think about this situation. A friend of Shmuel Wasser was saying this yesterday. Like, the idea of a building in America, not a third world country, as the mayor over there said, coming down is unheard of. A building in America, especially, I'm not talking a building, I only checked when their house was built. My house, I think, was built in the 50s, 60s. This is a building built in 1981, right? Not such a long time ago, relatively speaking. And to have a building come down anywhere in America is a crazy chiddush. This doesn't happen. And of all the places where HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose to do this, it was obviously one of the most densely populated Jewish buildings, in the world, right? You're right. In Bnei Brak and maybe Kiryas Yol, you'll have a building which is 100% Jews. But this is there's a lot of Jews in that building. You go to the Far Rockaway, you go to Flatbush, you find an apartment building, you might have similar demographics. That's really what it is. So yeah, for sure, there's no shiloh in this situation that there are Jews in the building, and to do everything they can to do that. I did ask last night, I spoke to someone from Hatzalah, I asked them practically, where are you holding, with Agabi this? Which is going to lead into our next issue. But, it's already 10 days post, the collapse. The odds of a person surviving are very slim. Agabi Hilchos Shabbos, we see here that when it comes to saving a life, Mechal Shabbos to save a life. If a person is not alive, then we don't do that on Shabbos. So I said, Stam, Hatzalah is there. What I knew, Hatzalah was there. I said, what's Pshat? So, Lamaisa, if there is any hope, if there is a potential for a person to be alive, so yeah, that's something to do. This is really, the main thing Hatzalah is there is really twofold. Is there's injuries and people, the excavators themselves, need first aid because it's a very delicate situation. But even more so, the families, the people connected, and even the people, the first responders, the people going in there, need Hatzalah they need mental help, and that's why they're there.
So they've almost transitioned to become a trauma unit.
Yeah.
As opposed to.
Yeah, very much so. And trauma can be in a person having heart, chest pains. A person can't take it, but it's really, really tough. It's one thing you run. You feel like when you save somebody, okay, you have something to work with, and you're just trying and nothing's happening. It's tremendously taxing on people. So he says that's first and foremost, why that's all there at the site. But if there's any chance of saving someone, then 100% we do that even on Shabbos. Yes.
If I recall correctly, after 9/11, they found some people alive weeks later.
Yeah,
I guess
Yeah.
in halacha, is there a law of diminishing returns? Like, one
Halach-
week we say after a week, I don't know.
Halachically, as long as there's a chance of life, I'm not there paskening. I don't know. When do you say, okay, it's we don't think the odds are that there's anybody there. I don't know. And I don't know. The halacha is there's always an ace. It is very tricky. It's very tricky.
I don't, Dr. Froland was probably in a better position to answer this than I am, but you've got an apartment building that has plumbing all over the place, there's water dripping, a
Right.
person could probably, how long can a person live just with water and no food? A couple of weeks maybe? Is that possible?
I had a patient who, she was from Haiti. She and her baby survived the earthquake that took place 15 years ago. The rest of her family passed away.
Mm-hmm.
She was in her kitchen
Right.
when the building went down. It was a multi-story building. The ceiling beam landed on the refrigerator and formed a triangle where she was able to survive with the food and with whatever water was available to her in there. Yeah, and a newborn baby.
It's unbelievable.
So it's not so far-fetched to think that,
10 days.
there's dripping water all over the place there.
So Dr. Frolinger's story of how, we'll say it over for the home audience if they didn't catch it, but an amazing story as a patient from Haiti with this woman with a newborn baby was in their home when the earthquake hit about 15 years ago, and she was in her kitchen and a beam with the refrigerator hit, crisscrossed, and she was in this teepee-like area, and she survived for 10 days just in the rubble until they got to her. Unbelievable. So yes, these things happen, and obviously we spell, for them, but really unfortunately the next step of halachas I'd like to discuss is when does the onset of avelos begin? There's people in this situation, obviously if a body's found, okay, so you begin avelos from there. But if a body is not found, but the searchers, give up hope. So there's one begin avelos. So it's the fair Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch, Yeridea, Hilchas Avelos, Siman, Shin Ayin Hey, Siv Zayin. Mishitava b'yam she'ein lohem sof. A person who's got lost at sea. Yatsa kol shahargul listim. Or people hear that he was attacked by bandits. Ushaguru chaya. He was attacked by an animal. Me'ema saimonim. When does one start counting avelos? So the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch says, this is Yaishu Levakesh. The point that they give up hope from finding him, at that point, one begins Hilchas Avelos. That's the Shulchan Aruch Paskins. Okay. They talk about unfortunate cases where they don't find the full body, partial of the body, and you count there. But then there's a case, let's say the family, they gave up hope, so they're sitting on Velas, and after that, they find the body. What happens then? Obviously, this is a tragedy on top of a tragedy. They sat Shiva, they sat Avelis, and then afterwards they find the body. So the halacha is in Nimsar Achash Nitzaysh Mimeno in a Krovim Tzrichim Lachzor L'Savo. The relatives wouldn't have to sit Shiva again, Lachzor L'Savo. Aval Habanim Im Shov L'Shosh Nimsar L'Savo also Hayom. L'Gormi Likel Etzamos. If they were there that day when they found the body, then they would have to sit Avelis. Sounds like, but if that day passed, then they wouldn't. Potentially that makes for a very rough situation. People could sit Shiva, and then if they later excavate the body, then they would have to not get a chance to look up. Does that mean they have to sit a full Shiva? Is there a shorter period of Avelis? Is it just in one day? Not sure. But there would be a second period of Avelis that they would have to sit. So obviously, halachically speaking, you don't want to put people through that. And it's in everyone's best interest, that they get that body as soon as possible, and people don't give up hope. And because going through the trauma of sitting Shiva because you gave up hope, and then finding a body and having to do at least some more Avelis is Maka al Maka. It's pretty rough. Practically speaking, there's another aspect here. The Shach over there, he says, skipping the first few lines, he says, Afiza, Mashakasav Oshiyotza Kol, Shagruchaya, Hainanami Be'inan Shemutaris Ishto Linase. That which we say that you're sitting Shiva is only in a case of where there's enough information for the wife to get remarried. And then he quotes the Shach, Shulchan Aruch Ibn Ezer Siman Yud Zayin Sifei, the Ishtar Asur Lahasbe Lovo Shchorim Kozman She'en Kan Eidos Shu Royli Siya Al Yada. If there's an issue of a woman getting remarried, if there's an aguna issue here, then we wouldn't allow someone to start sitting Shiva just because they're miyayish, they give up hope, if that unto itself is not halachically sound for her to get remarried. And there's a dichotomy. This halacha, look, once you're miyayish, technically speaking, Hilchos Avelos could begin. But do you know for sure that the person died? The standard for Hilchos Avelos, the Mechaber says, is once you're miyayish, you have a situation where you give up hope. We're not talking about a medical situation where, we're talking about a person's lost at sea, a person's, are they going to find them? So Hilchos Avelos is totally once they're miyayish, so that's when the Avelos can begin. But technically, the Shach is qualifying. That's only in a case of where it's not Nogea, a woman getting remarried. If it's Nogea, a woman getting remarried, we only let a woman get remarried if there's Eidos, which we'll talk about soon. That will be transition to our next topic. It's only if a woman can get remarried. And we wouldn't have a situation where a woman is sitting Shiva, but we're not going to let her get remarried. that itself looks like a stira, looks like the economy. So Mamela, in that case, we wouldn't let them sit Shiva yet, we'd wait. Yes?
There was a situation just a few years ago, the art site's coming up any week now, of the class, the Rebbe in Virginia, off the coast of Virginia, who
Yeah.
went out to rescue one of the boys and he ended up drowning. Some rabbi that question was posed to him and he said, Yeush, Sid Shiva. And there were other people, I guess, in the family, I'm not sure, who weren't so sure. They posed it, I believe it was to Reb David Zatzal. And he said, the Pharaoh, she said, no body, no Shiva.
So, thank you, Rabbi Burgess. It's a very illustrated story. I remember this too now. But that, unfortunately, that Rebbe who passed away trying to save a Talmud, the Rebbe was a Rebbe in Norfolk, Virginia. So they eventually did find the body.
They found the body, yeah.
But it seems originally someone told them this, mistakenly told them, oh, once you're Miyayish, you should begin Shiva. And then that question was then sent to Rabbi David Feinstein, who clearly said that it's the Shach, that no, if it's a Shaila, it's a wife getting remarried, you can't sit Shiva until you have a clear, heter. And Baruch Hashem, they did find the body over there. Yes.
Just find it amazingly appropriate that the Simon spells the word Shah.
Yeah. Interesting. Lamaisa, I did see in a psak from Rosner that practically speaking, these halachas are relative to the situation. If the case doesn't involve any married women getting, a woman being widowed and getting remarried, so then, look, the halacha of the Shulchan Aruch stands. It goes by Yish. Once they're miyayish, then you're supposed to sit Shiva. It does come with, like we talked about before, potential trauma when if they do find the body later, that there would have to be additional avelos. But if the case did not include any wives, so then we would go just based on Yish. But once it includes a wife, then you wouldn't. And I assume that's across the board, not just Lagabe the wife, but Lagabe, I assume it's the same thing, Lagabe everyone there. We're not going to possibly one thing for one member of a family and different for a different member of the family. So if there be any heter, shayla of a woman getting remarried, we would wait and not begin Shiva. Yes.
Given that they're supposed to now demolish the rest of the building, can't that pose additional hardship for this particular conversation, where now all of a sudden the amount of time in finding bodies or whatever else is going to happen.
It's a good question.
Joshua,
It works two ways.
Yeah, Joshua, you're asking, practically in this case in Surfside, has this shifted from a rescue mission to a recovery mission? And publicly, what I've seen, no one has made that admission yet. And so I don't know. You're right, they are working on that building, and they stopped
they stopped it again yesterday.
rescuing because they're now prepping the building for demolition.
One of the claims is that they can't access certain areas because they're too close to that part.
Right.
So once they drop it, they can access, and maybe they will find people.
Right.
So, two ways of looking at it.
Of course.
Dr. Frollinger's story was amazing.
Absolutely.
I heard, Rabbi Lipsker, the rabbi of the shul there in Bal Harbor, very strongly has been poskening that there's no Yish and nothing's done.
Sure.
In general, in Lubavitch, the Rebbe was very against Yish in these situations. There's a whole story about it. So yeah, I don't know that anything changed about that yet. Yes.
When would your time be?
Interesting. Even if they find the bodies, and or Chas v'Shalom, a situation of Yush where they start saying Shiva, but the Yurtzeit goes back to the day of the tragedy. So it's just the means of when to start the Avelos, but the Yurtzeit will still go back to the day of the tragedy. You know, it's Rachmanis. You know, we hope there wasn't a situation of where the person died in between the day of the tragedy and there. You know, I hope it's the type of thing we wouldn't know. You know, as Jews, that's why Chesed Shel Emes is there. You know, we hope they're not going to touch any of the bodies, and there won't be any autopsies and the like, at least in the Jewish victims of this. The third topic, which I'd like to address, which we already segued into, is the issue of agunas. And I believe that there are multiple situations like that here. And obviously, that's one of the most gut-wrenching parts of it, is here, you know, in a certain sense, by the 9/11, where we had major aguna shilos there too, some of those shilos were made easier because there was actually much more time in 9/11 than there was in this situation. From the time it started shaking till the buildings went down was at best a couple of minutes, really seconds.
It was also in the middle of the night.
It was in the middle of the night. And, you know, there's one famous call, you know, I don't think it was by a Jew, but and there wasn't a good issue. It was a wife calling a husband, a wife in the building, where she was able to call the husband in this situation, and that's what a lot of the testimony is coming from. Her description of what was happening to the pool sinking in. But there weren't, to my knowledge, there weren't too many situations like that where a person was able to get on the phone and call somebody. And that makes it tougher. You know, these halachas where the Chavetz Chaim was, I would use the lashon mekel when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos. You know, maybe the person's in the building, assuming the person's in the building, that's the gabe saving a life. And all these assumptions, look, it's a time when people should be in the building, we knew they went into the building, you know, those are halachos legabe Hilchos Shabbos. Legabe Hilchos Aduna, allowing a woman to get remarried, which chas v'sholom, in the situation where you let a woman get remarried, and it's not true that her husband didn't die. It's major mamzeris issues. The Gemara in Yevamos is very, very machmer on it. And aguna shilos are shilos that only heavyweight, super chashav rabbanim could paskin aguna shilos. Top of the line, tough shilos. That's what aguna shilos are. And so with these things, you really need a lot of information. And in these cases, it's tougher. I think these shilos might end up being tougher than the 9/11 shilos that Rabbanim got. And one of my friends, David, printed out for me, had 89 pages worth of tshuvas from 9/11. I actually know one of the postkins, from 11 from Lakewood. You know, they went through tremendous shilos to matter so many women in those situations. Here, in some ways, it might be tougher. Placing people in the building, no one in the building. But one of the things that we have, which we probably had in 9/11 too, to some degree, and I'm sure in the past 20 years it's become more advanced, is DNA. Is all across the spectrum in crime, in homicides, in death, DNA is widely used today. It seems, someone described to me, there's easy DNA kits, and it's very much used in the Western world in identifying things. The shaila is, halachically, do we trust DNA? does DNA have halachic status for these situations? Would we allow women to get remarried based on DNA? Now, DNA is obviously relatively a new thing. You know, the Gemara talks about allowing women to get remarried and identifying a body. So, obviously, the situations, you know, we hope there'll be bodies that'll be able to, even when they find the bodies, those bodies will be able to be identified. Not so simple. And the Gemara goes through different aspects. You know, how much of the face do you have to see? What do you have to see with body parts? But here, let's say this situation, you can't see anything. All that you have is you test the DNA and there's a match. So does that work or not? So these DNA shilohs were very prevalent in 9/11. And I saw some stat that Gedalia Dov Schwartz, who's the head of the CRC in Chicago, very chashuv posek, who unfortunately was nifter. You know, the difference of 20 years. You know, Rabbi Yoshev got some of these shilohs 20 years ago, by 9/11. The people very much involved in these are not here. Gedalia Dov Schwartz was a person very involved. But Lamaisa, there are interesting shittas I came across. In the bottom of the page, this is part of a tshuva signed by Shmuel Vosner and Nissen Karelitz. Interestingly, both personalities that we've given shirim on describing. Shmuel Vosner was a Rav in Bnei Brak. Nissen Karelitz was nephew of the Chazon Ish, a big posek in Bnei Brak. Fortunately, they too are not here 20 years later. But they both say the Gemara makes a differentiation. It comes up above Mitzvah between a siman and a siman muvhak. A siman means, yeah, this is like you have an identifiable sign. You know, in Hilchas Hashavas Aveda, that this object's yours. But there's something else called a siman muvhak, like just like you have a lashon talmud muvhak, a super siman. This is a siman that nobody could know except for you. That's a much higher standard. And for a woman to get remarried, you need a siman muvhak. A siman alone is not good enough. So both with Vosner and Nissen Karelitz argue that DNA is quite powerful. To utilize DNA is quite a solid proof. And it's close to, their lashon, right in the middle of the page, 5 lines in. The krover l'siman muvhak. It's close to the level of a siman muvhak. We're dealing with levels. There's a siman, there's a siman muvhak. So they say it's close to a siman muvhak. However, they write, Amnon, ein lim smoch ach v'rak abdika zu. You can't just rely on this. Elam kin yishma g'laim l'davar, unless you have other potential circumstantial evidence. It's sudden no safim and other halachic factors api halacha. Aval bedikas dalad nun aleph, which is the abbreviation for DNA. Shabbat Nasas Tima has been gufa nedar being horrible sense of inner yosef yisunim bein in bilvad. Here in the tshuva, they're machalik. There's 2 types of DNA you could use. You could use DNA from a relative, or DNA from the person himself. So DNA from a relative, that's nothing to talk about halachically for a woman to get remarried. That's at best a regular siman. DNA from the person themselves, in halacha, they're much more machshav. And that would reach closer to the level of a siman muvhak, but that alone they wouldn't suffice. They would also need, let's say, giving a potential example, the tzad of knowing the person was in the building. That plus that, the person escaped, okay, you have DNA, that's good enough. I'm giving you a possible equation, not possible in this, just to illustrate. But just using DNA, according to Rav Wosner and Renissan Karelitz, is not enough. It's very good. If it's just DNA of family members, not so good. But if it's DNA of the person themselves with other factors, we matter it. I found quoted Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg as well as Rav Elyashiv that argued. And they want to say, in their estimation, DNA fully has the din of the Siman Mavak, and thus with DNA alone, one could get remarried. That's what Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, Elyashiv Paskin. I believe there were a lot of cases in 9/11 which they utilized this psak. Yes?
DNA what form? The person's DNA or the family member?
Yeah. So the DNA that Rav Elyashiv and Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, very good for pointing that out, is the person's DNA. I think they're masking to the idea if it's a family member, that's not close enough.
Are you talking? Are they talking about finding let's say, the head or the torso of the body which is unrecognizable, but the DNA could show? Or could Josh's kids go out and play and they skin their knee? That's going to leave a DNA trace on the rock they skin their knee on. So
right. Yeah. So it depends. According to this second psak, or Elyashiv and Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, so they would say just DNA alone is good enough, and even if it's the case where there's no other semen based on the body, that'll be enough. But according to the first poskim, no, they would want more than that. I also saw from Rav Asher Weiss, he had a very interesting qualification. It sounds like he also was matter with DNA, but he gave the following point. He says, in Achanami, we do understand that Aguna is a major shayla. It's mattering in Eshes. It's shaylas of mamzeros. It's a heavy shayla. And when we say we use DNA, that obviously shows that it's very powerful, right? We'll compare it to Siman Muvak. But he says, realize though, in halacha, that's not eidos. He said, Lagabi Yerusha. Would I use DNA? I'm a child. You have this all this time, paternity suits. Major Yerusha, I'm a child. Dr. Basha Weiss, I wouldn't use DNA. What do you mean? You told me the woman can get remarried. A woman getting remarried, the Torah allows a Siman Muvak, Mishum Eguna Hikila Barabana. When it comes to a Guna, you want a woman to get remarried, there's a precedent in halacha from the times of the Gemara. Mishum Eguna Hikila Barabana. The rabbis were meko, and they allowed a Simanim, a Siman Muvak, to allow her to get remarried. But that doesn't mean, Asher Weiss argues, that DNA might be a Siman Muvak, but there are other things on top of the totem pole. There's eidos, it's not eidos. There's even a concept of an umdana, a non-sadi, it's not even that. So it's limited what we would use DNA to matter. Obviously this could be a whole share, but he says even if I'm using DNA fully to matter a woman to get remarried, that doesn't mean I halachically view DNA as absolute proof. It's not. Even DNA we're talking about from the person themselves. He says Eidos is something stronger than that. And the Umdana might be something stronger than that. That's what Rosh Weiss said. And unfortunately I'm sure they're going to have to turn to these areas, in this situation. One more area I quickly want to touch on, but and then to summarize and go forward. I think the other issue, which I think is very important to deal with, is the halachas of just general safety issues. The shmartum nafshel seichel. That There's an achrayus. We could go through Hilchos Mamonis, Choshen Mishpat, who's it on? The building owners, the building managers, this, that. But obviously when the person owns a building, the person's a landlord, when a person has their own house, there are safety issues involved in the world we live in, and you have to be careful about those. And sometimes there's like, okay, building codes, it's cheaper if I do things without, a permit and this. Now look, I'm not getting into Hilchos contracting. Can you do things with a permit or without a permit? But there are certain things, obviously, which are dangerous. And a person has to be, no one's above the law. And a person has to be careful with safety issues. Again, it's way too premature, and who knows what happened with this building. And the end result is, it's like HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's no shaila, this is not normal, it doesn't happen. So even where people violate and there's issues, who knows? But a person can't just, stick his nose, the county has many, codes and this. Don't forget, it's religious Jews. We should be machmer and mishmartim nafsho sechem, not makel, not just totally ignore. And I'm sure post this there's going to be volness, intrusive, annoying. They already evacuated a couple of buildings. I'm sure they're going to go overboard, and that itself will be a reason that people will say, "I don't have to listen to it because it's crazy." And okay, I'm not discussing that. I'm discussing just pure, simple, clear safety issues. People have to be careful about it. And what's eerie is if you look at all these tragedies that we've gone through the past over a year, whether it's COVID, whether it's the Miron tragedy, whether it's the Karl and Stalin bleacher tragedy, these are all issues that Nishmartim Nafsho Seichem came up. Sometimes it came up too late. But I'm not saying that's the cause and that's anything to do with why it happened. Hashem sending us messages. I don't know. But halachically speaking, from our simple halachic standpoint, we have to do what we can to guard ourselves from diseases. We have to do what we can to operate things in a safe manner. Chas v'shalom, things are not operating in a safe manner. Tragedies happen. And even if, no matter how unlikely they are, but they happen. I'd like to just end with a few stories. Some of them people might over here might have heard, some of them they didn't. A family that was living in the penthouse of those towers just a year ago. And Hashkacha worked it out that they moved from there. They still lived in Bal Harbor, Surfside, but they moved from those towers. 6 months ago, a year ago, you were in those towers. Quite amazing. You decided Dafka to move then. There's a story, someone from this neighborhood, an older single who had an apartment in those towers. Chazdei Hashem, he got engaged to a wonderful girl in Eretz Yisrael, went to Eretz Yisrael to get engaged, and had a ticket to come back last Sunday, 2 weeks ago Sunday, which would have had him in that apartment in Champton Towers that Wednesday night, Thursday morning. His Kala asked him, can you stay another week? They're saying the story, the Hashkacha, Hidafka, Hashem orchestrated, he's getting engaged after the age 30, waiting for many years, Dafka to have a Kala to save his life, that he stayed in Eretz Yisrael, didn't go back. There's a story of a family, kids go to Beis Yaakov, who the mother came back from an event by Chabad, she was still up, she noticed something off, and she grabbed her kids out of that house, and she was one of the people that actually survived and got out of that building. Amazing, amazing stories. Obviously, each one tremendous Yad Hashem, how they were there. How they were there, but got themselves out of the buildings. You know, people, you see these stories of the people getting out of those buildings, they're navigating, you know, no elevators, fallen debris everywhere. The building's not there. It's just amazing. Someone told me a beautiful vort that Rabbi Reisman said. In general, Hashkacha Prata stories of a person not being there, of a person escaping there. And it's something so true. He verbalized something probably that we all feel, but maybe don't realize. When you have a situation like this, and you hear stories of tremendous Hashkacha Pratas, how people were saved, that people weren't there, people got out, that's a chizuk and a nechama, not just for, wow, look how Hashem took care of those people, but to also come to grips and to understand that the same hashkacha pratis that saved this person is also the hashkacha for whatever cheshbonos we don't understand, that Dafka put this person in that building. Every single thing is with a plan. We see the plan, it's easier to accept the plan when we see how it turns out in our eyes, you know, okay, the person survived, the person is alive. But really, Kadosh Baruch Hu did the best for every person. It's what's supposed to be for every person. And we don't understand about how the people that were unfortunately stuck in the building, we don't understand it. But the same way that we get chizuk and we can appreciate the hashkachas Hashem for the people that made it out, we should realize it's also hashkachas Hashem, the people that were there. And as Hashem, you know, as we're in the 3 weeks and we're davening, you know, that Hashem should take us out of the galus. You know, some years it's harder to connect, especially this time of the year during vacation time. You know, it's hard to connect to galus when you're on vacation. I dare say it's hard to connect to the galus when you're vacationing in Surfside. But this year, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us, unfortunately, this tragedy. You know, it's a little bit easier to look forward to the Geula. It's a little bit easier to look forward to Be'ez Hashem. And Hashem will rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, and we'll all celebrate together in Yerushalayim, in Herav Yameinu. Thank you very much for listening. Next week we'll have the finale.